We are watching Hurricane Florence this morning. It is bearing down on the Carolinas. Businesses are bracing for economic fallout as well. We've got that impact as well, and the impact of tourism. Stay with us. Back in 1 minute's time. Hurricane Florence bearing down on much of the eastern seaboard today. Take a look at these pictures. The cost of rebuilding homes and businesses after the rain stops could top more than $20 billion. Joining us now to discuss that and a lot more, the founder and editorial director of TravelPulse.com, Mark Murphy. Mark, thanks very much.
Thanks for
joining us this morning. So how do you come up with the estimates in terms of what this might ultimately cost?
Well, the word is might. We don't really know what it's going to cost.
Sure.
So right now we're all just guessing. We think it's going to be a big number. They're talking about the economic impact being over $200 billion ultimately in terms of the storm. But again, we're still gauging, well, how much rain is actually going to fall, how much flooding is going to take place. And then for the folks on the tourism side, because we're covering the side from the travel news, what's going to happen when we come around to next season? Are they going to be ready to invite travelers? Because it gradually will build up in the spring. Summer's the big season. So I think from an economic impact on the travel side, it's minimal because we're already past the peak season. And then the question is, after this clears out, what's left and what's it going to take? I think what's always interesting whenever you have an event like this is the impact in terms of the rebuilding. It brings in lots of dollars. There is an economic influence, obviously, after the fact, and we'll just have to wait and see what takes place.
Hey, Mark, when these big hurricanes happen, does it change the view of tourists, post-mortem a year later? So do Americans tend to go more to those areas because they want to help bring back? Or is there kind of a stigma attached, like, I'm not sure it's ready for us to go to?
All right, so I think the biggest issue, it's funny you say that, the Caribbean, right?
Yeah.
A limited part of the Caribbean was impacted last year. But the mentality is all of the Caribbean is off limits.
And then it hurt travel everywhere.
Yeah, and there are parts of the Caribbean that never see hurricanes. Aruba, Curacao, et cetera. So when you think about it, the answer is really twofold. Yes, people will be like, oh, is it okay to go back? And then there are people like me that say, get on a plane and get back, because ultimately you're going to support the destination. And if you love the destination, then go back and support it. So I think it's about people like me and you folks getting out there and showing what's really going on the ground, because too many cases, whether it's Egypt and Tahrir Square, we're zeroed in a country of 80 million people in that case, and we're looking at 10,000 protesters, and you're not seeing the scope of it.
You make an assumption. Yeah.
Yes, Sendai with the
the states
tsunami.
have to come through with a big advertising campaign,
Correct.
right? And sort of just say we're back, we're ready for business, et cetera.
Yeah.
And presumably they will be. I mean, it can be done pretty quickly.
Absolutely. There's no reason why in 3 or 4 months they're not back to business as usual, and that's how it should. That's how it should be in this case.
In terms of this part of the country, though, this is Golf Central.
Yeah.
That there are so many very high-end golf courses in North Carolina and even down in the Myrtle Beach area. That's going to be critical, how much damage is done to these golf courses, because that drives a lot of the tourism.
No, absolutely. It's the beach rentals, it's multi-generational families. But what's nice about that economy down there, you've got agriculture, you've got huge agriculture business, you have farming, pigs, hogs. They're very diversified in terms of where they're getting the economic upside. So to me, I'd be more concerned about those industries, automotive, the manufacturers down there, and what's taking place in terms of them stopping production temporarily. What's the overflow of that? Those are the things that, when you look at it from a macro level, I believe it's an issue. I think on the golf course side, the rain's going to cause damage, but I think that can be quickly mitigated, and we've seen that in lots of other places. So
just a few more water hazards. I mean.
Well, yeah, and the biggest danger for anybody playing golf is me on the course at the same time.
Does this have a broader impact to the economy, or do you think this is contained to that area? Does this? Because Wilbur Ross, apparently the Commerce Secretary, said it's not going to impact the economy overall. Here's what he said. Listen to this. Get your reaction.
It's a very, very serious issue, particularly for agriculture, but also from the point of view of flooding. We'll have some impact on export-import. Now, since we import more than we export, probably that will be a little bit of a help to the economy. But it will slow down shipping. It will raise the cost of the transport because the vessel is on water more days. It'll have a lot of implications.
Your take, Mark.
So, yeah, I think it's isolated. I think it's limited because even $200 billion, if that's the economic impact overall in our overall economy, if you put it, it's a drop in the bucket.
Sure.
It's terrible for the locals there. I think when you look at businesses like the airline industry and how they're canceling flights and how they're going to have to eat some revenue and take some losses there, it's going to impact certain industries and certain businesses. But I think overall, this is something we've grown accustomed to. There's always something. You know, we had last year the hurricanes that hit, Florida, et cetera. Everybody's back. You
do get a
and
sort of
doing
local
great.
building boom
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Just to point out, with Eastern North Carolina, it is known for the military installations there, Cherry Point, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and then, of course, Camp Lejeune and Fort Bragg. But that is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, concentration of hog farmers in the nation and pork production. And much has been learned since the devastating flooding after Hurricane Floyd back in 1999, where the sewage lagoons, the manure lagoons, overflowed. So the factory farming practices have improved a great deal in the last nearly 20 years. But down in South Carolina, it's important to note the car manufacturing that's down there with the plant that BMW has, Daimler has a Mercedes plant, I believe, Volvo. So there is more manufacturing, and then Boeing has a very prominent plant in South Carolina. That's more manufacturing oriented when you get down into the South Carolina area.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's, Volvo came out and they said they're going to stop production at that plant, for several days. So I think that's where you get that buildup and everything kind of comes to a halt. So you're absolutely right. And it's interesting you talked about the runoff from the farming, because that has been a huge issue. And I think that's an issue whether you have a storm or not. Getting better at controlling that, that runoff that's causing, in some cases, they're talking about the sargassum, they're talking about the algae blooms, et cetera. That's really just a byproduct in many cases of the agribusiness model itself. So it'd be interesting to see how that.
Mark, getting back to your travel and tourism hat, with respect to consumers and store owners, and so many hurricanes coming over the last few years, are some of the store owners saying, "Hey, I've had enough," and not coming back in a full fashion, and just deciding, you know what, it's time to move on? I mean, is there a change happening in these coastal areas that you're seeing?
No, I'm not.
Longer term
actually.
impact.
I mean, I think, to your point, longer term. But in reality, if insurance is going to pick up the tab, and you have the National Flood Insurance Program, and you can tap that, people continue to rebuild in those areas, right? And so as long as there's the population and there's the draw, so I have a home in Fort Lauderdale, it doesn't matter. If there's a draw there, people are going to have the businesses.
But I was hearing some interviews before the evacuation where some of these store owners saying, I have to come up with now $3,000 more, okay, to do some of the things to protect the store, to protect that. I just don't have that $3,000. So most of this insurance comes after the fact.
Correct. And we saw that with Sandy up here, right? In some cases, it's years later, and people are still rebuilding, right? So when you don't have access to the resources, couldn't agree more. Sometimes you just get fed up and say, enough's enough. But for the most part, if you're talking about tourism areas like a Myrtle Beach, you're talking about, the coast of Carolina and the Outer Banks, these places have been staples of travel and tourism for decades. I don't see that changing, whether it's this storm or the next one.
Just really quick, we always talk about the economic impact because it pulls demand forward or pushes it off, and we buy things instead of going to the movies, for example. You'll go out and buy a generator instead of buying a new lawnmower. And I know for a fact, just talking to people on the ground, that like this storm literally saved some small businesses because people were coming in to buy a generator and buy all the.
So it goes both ways.
Right, exactly.
And the key is pushing demand forward.
Exactly.
That's the key.
Mark, thanks very much for your
Thanks for
insights.
having me.
Appreciate you weighing in there, Mark Murphy.